Okay, so now that you know how to create an unwrap for a given shape, we need to know how to position our islands in the unwrap window. So when you've unwrapped something, this is referred to as an island, and one object could have many islands. So for instance, if I were to take this UV island and move it over here, I've split that off using the Y hotkey to do that, right? But what we've got is multiple islands, right? So these are both called islands. And in general, we want to pack our shapes so that they all fit within this 3D space, but without actually overlapping each other, right? So I'm going to say take a series of geometric shapes which just come standard with Blender, and I'm going to join them all together, and I want you to sort of pretend as if these were all elements of a more complex character, not individual geometric shapes per se, right? I'm going to just grab the cones UVs, and I'm going to press A to grab them, hit G, sorry, A to select them, G to grab them, and then just move them off to the side. Because we can actually use all of our like 3D viewport transformations, right? We can use S to scale, we can say scale along the x-axis by 2, like these sorts of things, right? So we can use our G to manipulate, our S to scale, and our R to rotate. And we can type and do all the same things we can in 3D space. We just can't edit meshes in here because this is not mesh editing, this is just a 2D depiction of the actual meshes themselves, right? So I'm just going to take these individual pieces, and these could be like, you know, maybe this is the helmet of a character, this could be like their face, and then maybe their staff or something. I know these are just geometries, but just bear with me, right? I'm going to select just these objects and move them away, sort of out of the main square. And you'll notice that when I've got nothing selected, nothing shows. And when I have something selected, when I actually select faces, right? Or select the whole object, sorry, you can see something shows up. That's because I have this toggle off, UV sync selection. If you have UV sync selection turned on, then everything will show, and what you select will show. All right? So what I'm trying to do, if I select everything, you can see how they're all sort of overlapping. I'm trying to stop them being overlapping, right? That's what I'm trying to solve. And the way that I'm doing this is I'm just selecting elements and I'm just moving them out of the window to some place off to the side. And I'm going to do that for every single thing until they're all moved off and away, right? Cool. So now these are all of my major elements, right? But because these were all different objects and they were all different shapes, and presumably over the course of modeling I've unwrapped them into different like configurations, we can actually see that the relative scales of these are quite different. And you can see over here, if I go UV stretch area, not angle, area, this is going to essentially show you the difference in area of these islands between each other compared to their actual space in 3 dimensions, right? The long and the short of it is, if I select this cube, I can see that it has a high level of distortion because we're looking for a more blue color, like a deep blue. So this is either too large or too small relative to all of the other islands, right? So that's the first thing we want to do. If I scale this up, we can start to see that a bunch of the objects now start to become blue, right? This one here is too small. See how as I'm scaling it, it gets redder and redder and redder, and then these objects get lighter and lighter. They move away from that blue because this island is so distorted that it's impacting the rest of the island averages, right? So I would want to scale that up a touch to be more like this, right? And then I'm going to repeat the same over here. I'm going to grab, and there's a new selection method we actually have up here. Instead of just verts, edges, and faces, we can do islands as well. So Control Tab to change the selection method, clicking island, I can then just select the whole UV island, right? This one is too big and needs to be shrunk, so I'm going to shrink that down roughly to about here, right? So I'm just sort of eyeballing this, but I want to communicate to you the concept that we want these islands to all be roughly the same size, roughly in average. That's not always true, but in general it's going to be mostly true. But that's a really arduous way of doing that, right? Scaling them all to be roughly the same size. There's a button that we can search for. If I press F3 and type for average, there's this average island scale command. We're going to run that. That's going to auto-magically shrink everything to match their mathematical island average island scale. And you can now see that all of our objects have sort of a deep blue, except for this one, right? Because this one, the way that it's been unwrapped, it has a natural amount of distortion in its object, and so it'll never be perfect, but this is in general pretty good, right? Now what we want to do is when we're texturing, we texture in this sort of space. And this is the UV the UV space, and it starts in the bottom left. This is position 0-0, right, in the bottom left, and it goes all the way to 1 on the x-axis, and then 1 on the y-axis. So the top right is 1-1, the middle is 0.5-0.5, oh sorry, comma 0.5, and the bottom left is 0, right? Now the UV space actually extends further out, right? So even though this one is only shown, it actually extends much further out, right? So you can have UVs at position 2, it is 2 and then 1, and this would be 3 and then 1, right? And then you could have islands up here. Like if I select this vert up here, and I go into vertex mode and I select this vert here, we see this is at position 2 and some change, and then 2.3. So it's gone 1, 2, and then it's gone up 1, 2, and then 0.3, just a touch more, right? So the UV space is actually quite large. However, we pretty much always want to make sure our islands are within this scale. Why? Because this is the region that the texture maps to, and the texture will actually repeat infinitely. It'll repeat over and over and over and over again in this larger space, unless we tell it not to. But in general, it will. So that's something you got to keep in mind. All of these islands for your UVs need to exist within this boundary. So what we do is we basically just say, okay, we'll just scale these down and move them roughly into position, right? And I'll do this really badly. I'll just put them like this, and then let me get my islands. I'll move this here, and while we're working, we may naturally get a little bit of overlap, but we want to undo that overlap, because if we want to texture this large piece blue and then we want to texture this piece red, well, like, what's going to happen, right? The texture can only be blue or red, in this area, right? So we want to make sure that we're minimizing the overlap as much as possible. So I'm just going to sort of pack these in like this. This is called packing, UV packing. Cool. This is technically like a functional unwrap, but it doesn't make very good utilization of our space, right? If this is a large texture, we've actually wasted 75% of the texture. All this here is wasted, all this here is wasted, and all this here is wasted. So what we want to do is start scaling these up and repositioning such that the islands are as big as they can be mathematically, right? While still sort of existing within this bounds, right? So this is better. It's not perfect, but it's better, right? Another thing we need to assume as well when we're packing is we never want our islands too close. We never want our islands like this. We never want them this close, right? The reason that is because as in a game world, as you move away from objects, their textures will drop down in resolution, right? And as they drop down in resolution, they're going to start blurring and blurring and blurring, and eventually that blur is going to get so large that sort of the yellow pixels from this island will be sort of bleeding onto this island's, let's say, blue pixels or something. And at a distance, the player will be able to see that error. So in general, when we're packing, we don't want to pack things right side by side to each other. We want to have some amount of gap between them. There is a mathematical way to determine what that gap should be, but for now, you're just going to eyeball it. Just think about a gap between your islands, right? Minimize the gap because we want to maximize our relative density. It's called texel density that we're using on this, but we do want a margin there. That's the term. When you're looking at the space between islands, it's referred to as a margin, right? So basically, when we're packing, we want to think of, if we think about this, like what is the theoretical maximum scale that this collection of objects can be? Well, we know that our islands need to be contained within this larger space, right? So if I were to scale this up really big, this doesn't work, right? Because the largest possible island cannot fit into this space. So theoretically, the upper limit for our scale is such that if I scale this down, 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 until the longest island in one dimension, in one axis, basically touches the top and bottom, but with a little bit of margin, right? Then this is theoretically the best way that shape can be packed. Do you know what I mean? Like this, I can't, there's nowhere I can position this that gets me more usage of the texture space. Maybe in some cases you could do like a 45-degree rotation like this, which would allow you to make a larger island, taking up more space. But is that worth it? Is it worth it to do that, right? Because by rotating at 45, we've made painting, like straight lines on this, quite difficult. When it's just straight up and down like this, it's really easy, like in Photoshop or Substance Painter or any other program, to just paint a line down and paint a line across. Conceptually, it makes a lot of sense as well. People look at this and go, right, that's a cube. So sometimes, even though we can claw back more like relative texel space by rotating our islands weirdly, it's more often than not worth it to do that. Sometimes it absolutely is, but in the general case, not really, right? We wouldn't really want to pack like this, and that like that, right? We kind of, like, having things oriented in this horizontal or vertical way is actually worth something subjectively. So we're going to keep that, right? So that's how we're going to approach packing this. The very largest island determines the upper limit of our island scales, right? And then after that, I'm going to sort of look at the next biggest island, which is going to be one of these two, right? They're both pretty large in their own right, but looking at this, I can sort of think maybe that one could go there, or maybe if I rotate 90 degrees, this could go here, right? Now, we know that, like, we can't fit this in yet, but we're just sort of trying to smush them together as best we can, right? So maybe something like that, and then something like this, right? And then we pick the next largest island, this one here, right? There's really no other great place for this to go, but maybe we could pack this to, say, here. And then these ones are starting to get within the realm of workability because they need to just sort of smush in, right? And this is a pretty subjective sort of like way of doing this. Maybe like this, right? So this is like a relatively okay way of packing these, but we know that we need to stay within the bounds. So our hand is forced here at this point. We simply have to shrink the collection as a whole in order to get them all in the space, right? But by doing that, we may have potentially opened up some new ways to pack this, right? So maybe, and we're going to do a little bit of experimentation here, maybe if this was over here, and this was over here, and maybe if this was here, and this was here, we might have made a little bit of a gap down here that allows us to expand back up our shapes. Do you see that? So it's this sort of game that we're playing between, like, packing as efficiently as we can while making an unwrap that is relatively human readable with enough margin between elements so that they don't bleed together, and with sort of a common sense approach, right? I guess you could say. So for instance, we wouldn't necessarily want to put like the really bright glowing green stuff like directly next to the bright purple or dark wooden stuff, because, you know, maybe if we're texture painting and we accidentally make a mistake and bleed across, it's going to be very obviously like different, right? So there's sort of this common sense approach to it as well that you're just going to learn subjectively. But this here is like an okay unwrap, right? I'm going to make a copy of this, and I'm going to run a command that Blender has now, right? If I press F3 and I search for pack islands, this is like the computer automatic packing algorithm. I can hit enter, I can choose what kind of packing I want, and I can hit pack. And Blender's going to just crunch the numbers and come up with its best possible pack that it could do, right? It's left some margin, but, you know, not a whole lot. And, you know, this again is functionally like an unwrap, but whether or not it's a good unwrap is going to determine on the shape, the actual geometry you're depicting yourself, right? So if I flick back and forth between these and compare it a little bit, you can see how these are pretty comparable, like in quality between the two, right? So that's basically packing, right? So we can pack our islands together, we can rotate them, we can scale them, we can translate them, etc. We want to make sure we stay within this 0 to 1 border, and we want to minimize, well, we actually want to entirely prevent any amount of overlap that we have. And we want to ensure that there's some gap between them. There's some amount of margin between them, right? And that goes for the edges as well. We want margin from the edges, just a touch of it, okay? That's basically how to pack unwraps.